Welcome back to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. This is Kent Dobson. It is good to be back. I've been sick. Oh man, Michigan winters and kids coming and going from school. I'm sure you know what it's like. Maybe it was a bit of a man cold situation, but I was down and just now recovering. And today's podcast, in fact, is related to being sick because I want to make a podcast on vulnerability. So the title is I almost gave you the other title. I was going to call it The Cult of Vulnerability because there's something going on in our spiritual-ish circles, a lot of talk about vulnerability. And as a kind of ultimate way of being in the world, I suppose you could say. Hold on, I have to adjust my mic here. But I thought I'd give a less provocative title, but equally true, and that is the Vulnerability Hangover. I don't know if you've ever had one. Vulnerability Hangover. They're quite serious. I mean, I don't know, you're with some group and you overshare, and the next day you're like, what the hell was I thinking? And part of it feels right and part of it doesn't. And so I want to talk about that. And I think culturally speaking, I have a bit of a vulnerability hangover. I have a hangover from the overuse of this word. And I don't know, one of the things I like to do, not because I like to nitpick, but because I'm genuinely curious about words and how they're used. And I guess that's part of my craft as a teacher and a writer. Not that I'm, super good at it. I misuse words all the time, or I even use words I don't understand at times. But I like to pay attention to what's going on in the lexicon of psychology and spirituality, or what I call the psycho-spiritual world, or mind, body, spirit world, or the health world. What words are being used and why, and what is meant by them. And vulnerability is one of those words that I've been attracted to for a long time, and recently kind of like a little leery of and repulsed by at times. Like, what is this? So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about vulnerability, not as like, is it good or is it bad, but to try to get under the surface a little bit, and really even to talk about the origin of the word itself. And I think I'll try to share like some hints and guesses, title of my podcast, about the word and about its, it is an ingredient in a healthy spirituality, and let's try to parse that out a bit. And anyway, that's the train I want to try to cover today as best I can. And I want to thank you for being a listener. The podcast, it continues to grow a little bit, which is very, very exciting. So thank you. And you can help it grow by sharing it. It's really in your hands. That's the most direct way. I don't do any advertising or anything like that. It's just people who tell people that Kent Dobson has a podcast and you should listen to it. So thank you for doing that. And it makes a difference. And a special thanks to my Patreon supporters who have signed up to help me on a monthly basis. It makes a big difference, and I can't thank you enough. And it's also a platform where we can, converse a little bit, and you can share your thoughts and ideas and questions, and it helps the wheels turn and keeps my feet to the fire. And because I want this podcast to be helpful, and I don't often know in what way. And anyway, my Patreon supporters help me see little ways in which it's helpful, and sometimes unhelpful. But that conversation, I think, has been really life-giving to me. So thank you. And maybe just a couple things on the advertising front. I have a Lent Descent course, which is full now. So thank you for signing up for it. It's a 5-week online course, and I will be doing others, so you can stay up to date with what's going on in my world and different things I'm offering by signing up for my newsletter, which I'm actually doing. I sent out my first one. So anyway, the link is on my website, kentdobson.com. And the other thing I want to maybe drop a hint for is I will be doing 2 Israel trips in 2021, one in January, which is not that far away, and then one in April. And more information will come out in my next newsletter about it. But if that interests you, also send me an email through the website and I can get you on the potential interested person list. And I have some actually new ideas for how I'm going to do the next couple of Israel trips. They always evolve, but I've recently had some inspiration about how to continue to make these more interesting and life-giving and rewarding and so forth and so on. So I'm going to change it up, but I don't want to say much about that right now because I want to get into the podcast on vulnerability. So what is a good place to start? Let me think. Maybe with the definition. Vulnerability comes from a Latin word. And I don't want to do the whole etymology. You can look it up online if you want. But it's rooted in wound. So that already ought to change the conversation about what, quote, being vulnerable is. It is connected to our wounds. And what I hear in that, in the etymology of the word itself, has 2 sort of iterations. The first is our personal wounds. You could even say our core wound or wounds. And the capacity for contact with our core wounds. Because let me say something about our core wounds. We're often not in contact with them. Even if we think we are, we might be saying something that we think is emotionally vulnerable, but we might actually have no idea what our core wounds are and what stories are operating around those core wounds. And that's why really good therapy is so surprising for people. It's never what you think, in other words. So I think being vulnerable on the personal level on one level is about your relationship with your wounds. That is not the same thing as saying you should share them or talk about them or expose them or continue to expose them. I'm just saying contact with them. If you tell me I'm just trying to be vulnerable, I think to myself, how connected are you with your wounds? That's what the word itself is luring us toward. The other is maybe cultural. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but maybe larger than personal. Transpersonal would be the right way to put it. And that is our fundamental vulnerability as human beings. Our great wound, which is something like our consciousness around our own mortality and fragility and shadow light side. In other words, we're not so pure. And that's collective. That's collective. It's not, it's personal, but it's not personal. You're going to die, in other words. And again, someone's like, hey, I'm just trying to be vulnerable. How conscious are you of your impending death, of your mortality, or as the Buddhists say, everything is impermanent, including your present physical manifestation and your present consciousness, your state between the 2 mysteries of birth and death. So, and on one level, what is being vulnerable? It's contact with our own impermanence and vulnerability, or impermanence and mortality is what I meant to say. So that's interesting. If you know a little bit now that you do, of the definition itself, is that the way people are using it? And the short answer is probably not. What some people mean by vulnerability is emotional sharing. I have feelings and I want others to know about my feelings. And I'm not criticizing that. But that's what passes. Or being real, sharing my truth, passes as vulnerability. And what else might we say? I think maybe another way of saying the same thing is like people often use the word vulnerability and sharing in a vulnerable way, especially in small group context, as sharing unprocessed emotions. Or that's often what ends up happening because it's kind of contagious. I've been in small groups and small circles, and someone shares unprocessed emotional pain, or sorry, my phone's going off. And it's actually kind of amazing, but also contagious, and around the horn it can go. And oftentimes that sort of situation is what leads to a vulnerability hangover, where the next day you're like, what the hell was that? And then even worse, in the moment, maybe you hear someone sharing and you're non-judgmental and you're open to them and you're hearing and you're listening and you're accepting them. And the next day you're like, I don't know what the heck that was about. See, the context itself might, I'm getting ahead of myself because I want to, I have some ideas about this, but anyway, this kind of a scene of sharing unprocessed emotions often passes as vulnerability. I think another thing that's worth saying about the word itself is that in spiritual-ish circles, it's praised. In non-spiritual-ish circles, it's demonized. And maybe I'm caricaturing both of these a bit, so forgive me for that. But, business world or politics or the military or success, there's not a lot of room for that. In fact, it gets criticized as weakness. That's what I'm saying, as weakness. That vulnerability is weakness and therefore should be avoided and should definitely not be out in the public sphere. Now it's being challenged a bit by researchers. Or Brene Brown is one who's bringing at least a conversation about vulnerability into the workplace. And of course, probably not everything I'm saying here is going to harmonize with what she's been offering the world, but she's been offering a tremendous gift in bringing up the conversation around shame and around vulnerability and getting it not just in, and not keeping it just inside intimate relationships, but extending that out and even into the work environment. So hold on, I got to take a quick break. Okay, so I've got 6 or 7 things that, again, I'm offering as hints and guesses. Please hear my offerings as questions and musings and convictions, and of course I'm open to being wrong. And actually that is an expression of vulnerability. I'm not the center of the universe or of knowledge or of wisdom, and in fact I'm going to die. So maybe the first thing I want to say is that vulnerability, even as it's used kind of culturally right now, does not belong everywhere. And the idea or the expression that it does, like I'm going to really show up and really be my true self and really be vulnerable in all contexts, is a kind of it's an illusion. It's not possible on the one hand, and on the other creates a kind of unhelpful facade about what it is that you're up to. And it also is a way of forcing your supposed vulnerability on people and contexts that may or may not be deserving of it, or may not be the healthiest place for such a thing, and may actually be counterproductive. Now, I might be saying something that's kind of obvious, but I think it does creep its way in, especially if you're in kind of spiritual-ish kind of circles where vulnerability gets praised a lot. And so let me say it in a couple of other ways. Here's in the form of a question. Does the internet deserve your vulnerability? Now think about that in a very straightforward way. Does the internet deserve your verbal version or your image version of your supposed vulnerability? Does it deserve it? Is that the context for, come back to the original definition, for your core wound, the place where your core wound shows up or is exposed, really, because it's something we carry, our core wounds, and we carry knowledge and consciousness of our own impending mortality. And is this the context for bearing that open, for opening up the chest, so to speak? And I mean, and when you just put it that directly, the answer, it seems to me, is no. The internet does not deserve your vulnerability, especially in sort of a blanket way. And I'm even now thinking of a question. I ran into Brene Brown back when I was a megachurch pastor, and I put some questions up on my wall that came from one of her books. I don't even remember, and one of them I'm thinking of now is she said, I'm about to share something, and in sharing it, do I expect a certain response or not? And what will be my feeling if I get it or I don't get it? See, that's a question about context. In other words, I'm going to show up, I'm going to try to tell the truth as best I can, but what am I really doing? And am I expecting a certain kind of reaction or response or feedback? And if so, will I be disappointed if I get it or I don't get it? She's poking around in some of these questions of truth and of showing up and of exposing. Like, is this the context for exposing a core wound? And am I looking for a kind of response? Those are very subtle. Often we don't, it's like, I think those things are operating mostly on the unconscious level until we ask a question like that. And then it's like, oh, I see. Okay, I was about to tell this story and really I'm hoping for some sympathy. Or I'm about to tell this story and I'm hoping to be self-deprecating and funny and therefore liked. Or I'm about to share this fact that I found, and I'm actually really hoping to shock people. And, those are very subtle things, especially those of us who are teachers, often don't want to look at, because we think, well, it's funny, or, well, this is what happened to me, and I'm just telling you a story, that's all. But that's not all. That's not all that's going on. So just what am I highlighting? I'm highlighting the question of context. And I think you can bring this even down to the group level, like the small group level or your group of friends. Does this person or these people, do they deserve? And deserve, I know it is a tricky word, because you might find yourself feeling morally superior, but that's not really the way I mean it. Maybe the better question is this a sacred context for my wounds to be exposed? And if the answer to that is no, don't. If it's not a sacred, and I'm not exactly saying safe space, I'm avoiding that a little bit because that's also overused. I could do a whole podcast on safe spaces, and I kind of have mentioned that in the past. But sacred space, I think, is better, because if you show up in a vulnerable way in the world, that is unsafe. There's no context of full safety for that kind of vulnerability. It's actually an experience of one's utter vulnerability. That is an unsafe kind of experience and feeling. So you can't expect that on the outset. So I think a better way of putting it, or a more subtle way of putting it, is sacred. And will it be held in a sacred way or honored in a sacred way? And I think I have to also be open enough to be challenged in that way. And maybe this leads to a kind of a sub point of this, is that vulnerability right now, the way it's being used, the word is often used like a weapon. Something like, I'm going to really share this emotionally difficult thing, and you don't have then the right to question me. And that happens a lot. I used to work with young people, and oversharing like this, the result often was, and I think it's a kind of defense mechanism in a way, is to say, you can't question me, you can't challenge me. It's not quite the same thing. Again, back to my definition of vulnerability. And I'll give you an example that was kind of tragic. So I used to work at a Christian school, and we had chapels. And imagine, 700, 800 kids gathering once a week or more than once a week. And we'd have some music and often a teaching, and I'd do some teaching and other teachers would, and sometimes we'd have guests, and I often did the music too, along with students, and a lot of it was student led, and me and another guy were in charge of chapels essentially, and I can't remember how the circumstances came about exactly, but we sort of handed over a few chapels to the students, and they chose this one girl to give a talk. And I didn't see her talk ahead of time. I don't know about my colleague, but she had created a talk, and she had some slides and so forth. And it turned out she had a really significant skin disorder of some sort. And she was also a very beautiful person, but you couldn't really tell because she didn't have much of the skin disorder on her face. So it was mostly covered, in other words. And she's giving the talk, and as soon as she started, I was like, oh, shit. This is not, in my view, a sacred context. 700, 800 students going down this path. And then she put up a photograph of her back. And it was a very provocative and vulnerable photograph. Wrong context. But in the kind of, I think the students, as best they could, some of them, handled it very well. Others did not handle it very well. And it had that counter effect. But the odd thing about is, like, you can't then now say anything negative about me because I've overshared here. And it's kind of creates a kind of protective shield that doesn't actually work, because then students are talking about behind their back, they're talking about that photograph, and they're like, ooh, they're saying little comments because they're freaking teenagers, and don't act like adults are any better. They're not. And again, back to the question of context, and that's what I mean as a kind of a weapon. It's used as a kind of weapon. And here's another example. When I worked at a megachurch, one time we set up a new committee, and we said to some of the employees, you come up with the rules for how we're going to, it's kind of an executive sort of committee, and lots of different people were on it. And we were trying to tackle a problem, and they came up with a list of rules, and rule number 1 was be vulnerable. And I thought, this is like the opposite. You can't demand such a thing. You can't say you have to be vulnerable. Otherwise, I'm not playing the game. That's, again, a kind of immature use of it as a sort of weapon. And you hear it now in relationship problems. Well, my problem is my partner's not being vulnerable, or so-and-so's not being vulnerable, or my boss is not being vulnerable. And I mean, at a certain point, you're like, what are we talking about? But I think what most people mean is they're not being emotionally open or available or raw or real. And sometimes they just mean something more simple, like they're not telling the truth, which may be the case. But again, is this the right context for core wounds? And is being real really about unloading either your unprocessed emotion, your traumas, your pains, your wounds on any willing subject? I say no, that does violence to you and to the person, to the audience, to the context. It does violence. It forces something, and it ends up doing violence to you personally, which can lead to a vulnerability hangover. So I think I imagine you're probably tracking with what I'm saying. And maybe since I mentioned something about intimate relationships, I've been thinking a bit about this. So I agree that an intimate relationship without vulnerability is not an intimate relationship. But it's not about sharing, I don't think. It's what happens in a real intimate relationship is that your wounds get exposed. That's what happens. You don't choose necessarily to expose them. They get exposed. That's the definition of an intimate relationship. It really is that this person experiences all of me over time, and not in a pretty cleaned up, sophisticated, linear timeline of progressions like, oh, I revealed this and now I'm going to reveal this. And now I just mean, no, actually something much more raw, which is at times, and often the most inconvenient times, all of a sudden my wounds get exposed. There they are. And often that's coming out in the terms of reactivity or being hooked by something or some obsession that you have a hard time explaining, and it's really connected to your core wounds and core scripts. And that's what happens in an intimate relationship. And an intimate relationship that can withstand the other's woundedness is a real intimate relationship. It's like what Rilke says, where two solitudes bow to one another. There's a kind of honoring of the sacredness of the other and their woundedness without fixing it or bandaging it up or explaining it away or saying, oh, those are old stories, let's create a new. No, someone's core wound is their core wound. I just thought of it, like, to make it light, I just thought of a Pearl Jam lyric. Are you strong enough to be my man, bandage hand in hand? Yes, I'm a Pearl Jam fanatic, so they're always floating around in my head. Not that he's like the greatest lyricist, Eddie Vedder, that's ever lived, but anyway, are you strong enough to be my man or other, bandaged hand in hand? Because that's what it feels like. It's like your wounds are there, but there's a kind of strength that's needed just to face them. And maybe that's where the bandage is. And I'm probably making a little bit too much of this like one line that popped into my head, but whatever. Okay, so those are the first sort of three things I was thinking a bit about that are worth kind of turning over, I think, in your head. Another thing I'd like to say comes from David White. He says it much more directly. He says, vulnerability is not chosen. And I heard him say that and I was like shocked. I was like, what do you mean it's not chosen? I thought I'm choosing vulnerability. I'm going to show up and be vulnerable. He says it's not a choice. If you're choosing it, you're deluding yourself. Actually, being vulnerable is the fundamental way of being in the world. It is the fundamental way of being in the world. The question is, how connected are you to the fundamental reality of your own existence? That's what he's saying. Meaning your mortality, your woundedness, your capacities for greatness, your capacities for darkness, your inability to control all the factors of your life, all of those things, the rawness of just being exposed to life itself. That is not a choice. The only choice is involved is in how many layers you are putting between your fundamental reality and who you think you are. All the strategies and coping mechanisms and stories and layers you're actually stacking up and putting between you and that fundamental reality. So again, that shifts the conversation to, you want to be vulnerable. It's a question of walking with tremendous courage toward the anxiety of your own existence. And that has nothing to do with sharing anything at all with anybody. In fact, maybe it's time for a poem. So I thought of this poem. I may have shared it before. It's so freaking good. This is a poem by Naomi Shihab Nye, and it's called The Art of Disappearing. In case you need some permission here, when it comes to our culture of oversharing, when they say, "Don't I know you?" say, "No." When they invite you to the party, remember what parties are like before answering. Someone telling you in a loud voice they once wrote a poem. This is at the party. Someone telling you in a loud voice they once wrote a poem. My version. Someone telling you in a loud voice they once gave a sermon. Or someone telling you in a loud voice, whatever. greasy sausage balls on a paper plate, then reply. So remember what parties are like before you answer, then reply. If they say, we should get together, and I'm going to extend it, we should get together, we should really talk, we should really connect, say, why? It's not that you don't love them anymore. You're trying to remember something. It's not that you don't love them anymore, but you're trying to remember something. In parentheses, I might add, your fundamental way of being in the fundamental reality of your own existence in the world. You're trying to remember something. Who am I really? That's too important to forget, she says. Trees. The monastery bell at twilight. Tell them you have a new project. It will never be finished. When someone recognizes you in a grocery store, nod briefly and become a cabbage. When someone you haven't seen in 10 years appears at the door, don't start singing him all of your new songs or sharing about all your wounds and the work you've done. When someone you haven't seen in 10 years appears at the door, don't start singing him all your new songs. You will never catch up. Walk around like a leaf. Know you could tumble any second, like the definition of vulnerability. Then decide what to do with your time. Again, that's the art of disappearing. So, what's another way of putting it? I think David White and maybe Naomi here is saying something like, being a certain way in the world, being is much more important than sharing, being. And trying to remember one's fundamental way of being and the things that are really calling to you, like she says, like trees or the monastery bell at twilight, things that really ring your bell, so to speak. And maybe vulnerability, if you begin to think about it less like words and more like a body posture. Like, here's an interesting question. What body posture reflects your core wounds? And what would it look like to put your body in that position? That would be an act of getting in touch with vulnerability. What body posture expresses your core wounds or the fragility of your own existence? So maybe here's the fifth thing I want to say about it. When it comes to sharing what it's like to be us, which is a lifelong task, and maybe as an aside, why are we talking about vulnerability anyway? Because it's part of growing up and coming into greater consciousness, and we desperately need to grow up. As Bill Plotkin says, we live in a patho-adolescent culture. We're pathologically adolescent as a culture, and it's our center of gravity as a culture. Very few adults out there, and very few healthy, generative, life-giving adults, and even fewer elders who are telling us the stories and protecting the earth and thinking about the next 7 generations. So why are we talking about vulnerability? Because it's part of the process of growing up. So it matters. But we often don't know what's true when it comes out of our mouth. So one of the teachers I like, I one time heard her say, I'll never betray that inner voice. I thought, oh, that's nice. But which one? Which one? Like the ego? Or some persona, some mask, some wounded child, some loyal soldier, some escapist, some lion tamer, some shadow, some prince or princess. I have like a whole army of people, of inner voices, so to speak. So easier said than done. So the task itself is noble. It's the path of soul to say, I want to choose authenticity. And you don't get to find out about authenticity except by choosing it, except by walking bravely into the reality of your own existence, saying, this is what it's like to be me. But at the same time, you're saying, the moment you say that, there's a seed of doubt in there that says something like, and you are just finding out. And after all, I mean, I've said this before on the podcast, but the person, your best friend, your spouse, your lover, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, your parent, they are your kid. In truth, they are a fundamental mystery unto you. You think you know them, barely. Hints and guesses, but they are a mystery. And if that's the case, it's also the case on the inner landscape. You are a mystery to yourself. So this whole obsession with being real and showing up and telling your truth, I mean, I have to remind myself, okay, I'm going to show up. I'm going to say what I think is true and needed in this context. And especially, I might ask questions like, is this a sacred context? Especially if there's some woundedness involved. But I have to also have the courage to say, I might be wrong. I might be wrong about the way I'm putting things, about the story that I'm spinning. And I don't know, I'm in my 40s now, and I've seen even major life stories that I've told for years dissolve, get rearranged, get dismantled. And sometimes by telling them and telling them again, I feel myself, wait a minute, I don't know if that's true anymore. Or that's the way I saw it, but I think there's a whole other landscape just beneath that story that I've committed my life to telling and retelling. I mean, think about the cliche version. Like, you probably all know the guy, usually guy, but not exclusively, who's living in the glory days, and every single time you get together, it's like, oh, that reminds me of, one time in college, we were hitting a few beers, and then a very funny story comes out. And it's like, once you've heard it 10 times or 15 times, you realize, okay, they're stuck. They're stuck in that persona, that mask, that way of being, that way of telling the story. Wouldn't it be interesting if that story began to dismantle, and questions like, wait a minute, why was I doing that? Why was I trying to pull this prank? And then all this, whatever, I don't know. But that's what growing up looks like. Even our stories and the stories we tell about ourselves and what we call the truth gets rewritten. Especially if we are on any kind of authentic spiritual and psychological path. That's the path of growth. The stories themselves get rearranged. And here's two more things. Number 6. When I first encountered Bill Plotkin, one of my teachers, who started Animas Valley Institute in Colorado, where I'm in their training program, I first heard him teach with Richard Rohr, and somebody gave me a copy. This is like back in the days of CDs and bootlegging stuff, and I mean, that still goes on, not CDs so much, but anyway, someone gave me a copy, and I was really interested because at the time I was just super into Richard Rohr, and I kind of was like, well, I don't know, this other guy, Bill Plotkin, whatever, but my experience was quite the opposite, where I was like, okay, I like Richard Rohr, but whatever this other guy is saying, I've never heard anybody talk like this. And if I remember correctly, he was talking a bit about rites of passage, and it just lit me up. I mean, both because I had read some Joseph Campbell and some other writers on rites of passage, and I felt a kind of cultural hole in this area, and maybe personal hole too. And then he started talking about the Vision Fast, and at that point I got into some of his writings, and the Vision Fast itself, which according to Bill Plotkin, he is trying to create a contemporary expression of the Vision Fast. He's not trying to do some Lakota thing or some Native American thing, but fasting is one of the most universal and oldest expressions of spiritual discipline or a consciousness shifting practice that we know of. I mean, that's Jesus, 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. So in any case, it also scared me. And I've done a vision fast, a 4-day fast out in the wilderness. It's a little bit longer experience at Animus, where there's some prep work and group work and then some post stuff. So it's very intense. But the whole point, the symbolic point of a vision fast is to expose yourself to the way things are, to the natural world, to empty yourself, to not even go with any food, to not have any inputs, no iPhone, no cell phone reception, no distractions, no food, just enough shelter so you don't die out there. But it is actually much closer to the fundamental nature of being, meaning vulnerability in its traditional sense of the word. It's an experience of vulnerability. And it's funny because I can even now, I did one a few years ago, barely have words for the experience itself because it was happening unto me. And I was experiencing myself in my own fundamental nakedness, to put it that way, and the fragility of my own existence, and also with my desires and hang-ups and desire to do something meaningful in my life and with my life, and to listen to voices beyond the ones that had, controlled me up to that point. I'm saying that all kinds of other factors stirring around in there. But this idea that we would expose ourselves to nature without all of the tools and mechanisms and words is an experience of vulnerability, and it requires solitude. And I think if I could sum up the aim of this podcast is to say something like this: it's much more likely that the practice of solitude in your life will lead you through the transformative gates of vulnerability than a companion, than sharing, than groups, than Facebook, than the internet, than blog posts and books. Solitude. This, as Rilke says, to walk out into your heart as onto a vast plain. To walk out into your heart as onto a vast plain, and there the immense loneliness begins. That is vulnerability. And it's not so pretty. I mean, how can that freaking be popular? And I think this invitation of solitude is so countercultural. I mean, and I can feel it in my own life. I mean, when I go to wild places, it takes me about a day, sometimes two. Sometimes I have to go through a series of rituals and prayers to help me let go and just accept the fact that I'm in a wild place with no cell phone reception. Because it's like there's a clinginess to our culture. And at every moment, like I was making this podcast a minute ago and my phone's blowing up and I forgot to turn it off. And it's like at any moment, anybody can annoy me and ask me questions about anything. I got a text about a jacket that was on sale from my friend. So, I mean, thanks. I'm interested in the jacket. But it's just like constant. Nothing in our culture praises or invites us into the transformative gates of solitude. And there's nothing like solitude to lead us to vulnerability and to a deeper experience of our fundamental fragility and mortality and closer to our wounds. And here's the final thing I want to say, and it comes from Robert Bly. He says, to rise, you must descend into your wounds. The fundamental transformative story of human nature is to rise, you must descend. That's the death and resurrection of Jesus. That's reincarnation, the cycle, the birth, death, birth, death, or the life, death, life cycle. It's saying the same thing. To rise, we must descend into our wounds. We think it's the opposite. To rise, I must overcome my wounds, fix my wounds, heal my wounds, just expose them so that people can see them and then move on. No, to descend into them. And that's not such friendly territory. You might need some help on that particular journey. It's definitely countercultural. But I think to offer another definition of vulnerability, as I've been trying to hover around it in my own way, is to use Robert Bly, which is, to rise, you must descend into your wounds. So, my friends, I trust there's something you heard and that piqued your interest, that got like a thorn in your side, or I hope challenged you or encouraged you to keep going on this, on the wild and transformative path of death and resurrection, of rebirth. So thanks for listening.